celebrated 100 years of its existence. Just 12 delegates were present at its inaugural conference on a boat in Zhejiang in 1921. It now has 92 million members and has led the Chinese government for 72 years. Its achievements in dismantling feudalism, putting an end to foreign domination, uniting the country and improving the living standards of the population are extraordinary. At this event to mark the centenary of the CPC, we have a fantastic range of speakers from across the world to discuss the evolving history of the Chinese Revolution, in particular its relationship to the global movement towards socialism. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ben Chacko, editor of Britain's only socialist daily newspaper, The Morning Star. Since its foundation in 1930, The Morning Star has been an internationalist newspaper, opposing imperialism and supporting colonial liberation movements and socialist countries. Of course, socialist countries have their flaws and their problems, but the huge anti-communist bias of Western media and establishment institutions has always wildly exaggerated these, and China has recently been subjected to a barrage of hostile propaganda across the Western press and from Western politicians. At the Morning Star, we have a responsibility to counter this anti-China campaign with more accurate and balanced reportage. Today's webinar is part of that commitment on our part. We're a small newspaper on a shoestring budget, and the pandemic has hit us hard. So if you like what you hear today, do consider subscribing to us online or in print. Details will be posted in the chat. Friends of Socialist China is a new platform based on supporting the People's Republic of China and promoting understanding of Chinese socialism, an understanding that is sorely lacking in the West. The first Friends of Socialist China webinar was held last weekend, bringing together speakers from China, Nigeria, Bolivia, India, Britain, Canada, and the United States to explore how China has been able to achieve such extraordinary successes in the field of poverty alleviation. Its website, socialistchina.org, I think a link will be put in the chat, attempts to consolidate the best articles and videos related to China and Chinese Marxism, along with original analysis by the editors, Carlos Martinez, Danny Haifong, and Keith Bennett. This meeting is streaming live on the Morning Star Facebook page and on the Friends of Socialist China YouTube channel. Our first speaker is a brilliant Chinese journalist from CGTN who's been doing a huge amount to counteract the propaganda against China since the start of the new Cold War. It's Jingjing who's joining us here from Beijing, so I'm really delighted that she's been able to join us live from the other side of the world today. I'm going to hand over straight away to Jingjing. Thanks, Lee.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you so much for having me here. And also it's my great honor to be here with you guys. So as you all know, China just had this grand ceremony for the Communist Party of China's centenary. And I was working as a journalist at the ceremony the whole time. So today I'd like to share some stories at the ceremony and the whole mood in China these days. You know, these days, a lot of Chinese people voluntarily went to send flowers to a road sign in the city of Hefei. The name of the road is Yanshao Road, which was named after two young men, Chen Yannian and Chen Qiaonian. They were among the leaders of CPC 100 years ago, along with their father, Chen Duxiu, who is one of the founders of CPC. And both of the two young men were tortured and brutally murdered by Kuomintang in their 20s for fighting for the future of China. So to commemorate these two heroes, the road was named after them. And you know, what's really touching is that this road leads to another main road in the city called Road of Prosperity. Those two young men didn't survive to see today's China, but they paved the way for us, generations of Chinese people after them, to the road of prosperity. There were hundreds of thousands of people just like these two young men who was searching for the best way to develop this country and sacrifice their lives for their China dream 100 years ago. And now we look back at this history. Their death, of course, was extraordinarily meaningful because they exchanged their lives for a better future for us, for China. But you know, back then, they didn't know what would happen after their death. They didn't know whether they would succeed. But still, they were willing to make this sacrifice for this unknown future. So these heroes have never been forgotten by the people here. And since July the 1st, Chinese people, countless Chinese people across the nation went to commemorate those heroes on this road sign, because we are not taking this life we have now for granted. And during the ceremony, Chinese President Xi Jinping said, Chinese people will never allow any foreign force to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. Anyone who attempt to do so will find themselves on a collision course with a great wall of people forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people. But not only the literal translation of a Chinese idiom by some Western media is hilarious, many Western mainstream media depict it like another wolf warrior strategy by China. Yet I think they're turning a blind eye at this history of China, how it was invaded, occupied by many foreign invaders from Britain, France, Germany, Japan, Italy, how it lost so many lands, how it couldn't have a say about their own land. And this centuries-long humiliation, it took China over 100 years to finally develop from a war-torn, aggressors-occupied country to now the world's second largest economy, lifted over 850 million people out of poverty to help Chinese people to stand on their own feet. And of course, with this collective memory, Chinese people won't let it happen again. Especially we are now seeing some governments, some people are trying to do it again in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in Xinjiang, in Tibet. So 100 years ago, you see those CPC pioneers told Chinese people, if we all unite and fight together, we will build a strong country that provides better life for everyone. And decades ago, when we were little, we always heard from the news, from China's policies, from history textbooks, that the country's goal is to build a moderately prosperous society in all respects. Our goal is to reach collective prosperity. Back then, it sounded like a far-fetched dream or just a slogan. But actually now, decades later, when we look at our lives, we realize those goals are really becoming true. We successfully ended absolute poverty and built this moderately prosperous society. And the people that witnessed the biggest change of their life in the past few years are actually the impoverished people. So they were not empty slogans. It's becoming our true life now. And of course, those changes couldn't be made if there weren't millions of people devoted themselves helping others. I also would like to share some stories of the people that I talked to at the ceremony. I think that in the West, there's a huge misunderstanding towards CPC because of years of demonization by the mainstream media and politicians. So I hope I can give others a picture of the people that make up the CPC. At the ceremony, many people who made great contributions in their respective areas were invited to attend. They come from all work backgrounds, all ethnic backgrounds. There were workers who made great inventions and received medals for outstanding contribution. There were doctors who went to the front line in Wuhan saving COVID-19 patients. There were Tibetans, Mongolians, different ethnic people from different ethnic groups. They were outstanding members in their community. I made a vlog about this, by the way, showing the behind the scenes of the story. So if you're interested, you can check on my channel. But I want to tell the story of this couple who are from ethnic group. They have been working as teachers in the village called Cliff Village for 31 years. This cliff is called Cliff Village because it literally located on a steep cliff in the Daliangshan Mountain in Sichuan province. And that place has the most hostile geological conditions. Kids, villagers had to climb a ladder on this steep cliff for 40 minutes to go to school. And with that condition, you can imagine how hard it was for villagers to make a living. And that place was the last battlefield for poverty alleviation too. But this couple have been teaching kids from impoverished families there for over 31 years. So I asked them, like, why? Why you choose to stay in such a place for so long? And they were like, you have to put yourself in other people's shoes. We'd be upset if we were the villagers and our kids couldn't go to school. The woman had tears in her eyes telling me about her life. She says, I feel happy that those kids need me, and I feel happy I can help change those kids' life, their future. And this couple are not the only one. There are millions of people who devoted themselves in helping those impoverished people. A teacher named Zhang Guimei received the July 1st medal because she built a free high school for girls in villages for 12 years. You see, in impoverished regions, some adults tend to prefer boys over girls. Some impoverished families would send all the boys in the family to go to school and leave the girls at home doing farm work or chores. But Zhang Guimei believes if the girl get education, she can change at least 3 generations of the family. So she donated all her salaries, bonuses, savings to provide free education for those girls from impoverished families. And she wouldn't spend all the money to cure her sickness, her diseases, even though the government provided him like the medical care and the money to cure her disease. She still spent those money to those girls. And you know what? Nearly 2,000 of them went to colleges. So there were countless people just like them that selflessly devoted all they have to help others. You know who they are? They're just ordinary Chinese people. And they are all members of a CPC. And they see the goal of their life is serving the people. Those are the stories I, as a person born and raised here, witnessed. China successfully fulfilled their goals in the past 100 years, and I have full confidence in the next 100 years. And that's all my speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jingjing. That's really, really a great window into the lives of ordinary Communist Party members in China, which I think is one of the areas where China is misrepresented in the West as a country that is not responsive to its people. But as we know, the Chinese Communist Party is an enormous mass party, most of whose members have ordinary jobs, and their remarkable achievements recently have been quite inspirational. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Robert Griffiths of the Communist Party of Britain. Rob has visited China on multiple occasions, traveled widely in the country and met people from all walks of life. And he has written for the Morning Star recently about the contrast between what you find out visiting China and the reports about China that you read in the Western media. So Rob's going to talk to us a little bit about that today. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, all comrades and friends. I know that one doesn't necessarily have to go to a country to form ideas about it that are accurate, and in some cases condemnatory. I never went to apartheid South Africa, but I've no doubt at all from the range of reports from inside and outside the country that this was an evil regime that had to be opposed and overthrown. But I am nevertheless astonished by the number of people, particularly, I suppose one could say those who read The Guardian, who have such hard and fast opinions about China, and not only have never been there, not an essential qualification, but clearly know next to nothing about the country as it actually is. Because going to a country does at least give you an accurate idea of what you see and hear, provided you do so, of course, with an inquisitive mind. I did a brief item on Radio Cymru, the Welsh language, BBC Welsh language channel the other day about the centenary of the CPC. And I was invited to speak first, and I gave a potted history, if you like, of the 100 years of the CPC, but in particular its achievements. It was all over in about a minute, and then they turned to a businessman based in Shanghai, the vice president of the Cola Company, a United States multinational, and they asked him whether, in fact, I had not given a completely inaccurate and highly optimistic picture of China and its achievements. I'd already been challenged by the interviewer on that, but hadn't had any opportunity really to respond. Well, his response was, in Welsh, of course, well, Robert is absolutely spot on in what he is saying. And that vice president went on to describe aspects of life and society in modern China that chimed completely with my own impressions, and made it very clear to the interviewer that what the characteristics ascribed to Chinese society and the Chinese people were so fundamentally at variance with the truth that he experienced this for himself, that they, quite frankly, they couldn't wait to close down the item quickly enough. I won't recite all the points that he made, but he did make it clear that the Chinese people are not some poor downtrodden mass that needs to be liberated by the imposition of a Western capitalist model of liberal democracy. But I think perhaps the most appropriate contribution I could make to this morning would be just to draw on some of my experiences there in three particular areas. First of all, the environment and environmental questions. Secondly, my visit to Xinjiang province, the Uyghur province. And thirdly, perhaps a little bit about militarism and so-called Chinese military expansion. One of the enormous areas of progress and development that I saw in many different parts of China on multiple occasions were the enormous advances being made in terms of the environment and China's ecosystem. I visited an old industrial village, for example, that had been a center of the iron industry. We have these old iron villages, of course, here in Britain, descended from the Industrial Revolution. The enormous effort that had gone into not only cleaning up that whole area on a scale that I have rarely seen attempted, let alone achieved in Britain, but in fact, all of the local villages now lived in the most modern, spacious houses that most people in Britain could only dream of living in. This wasn't a show village, by the way. We traveled through other villages that looked exactly the same, all with solar paneling, all with the latest mod cons and technology. We visited the houses, we talked to the people who lived in them. It was quite spectacular. We visited one of the most technologically advanced waste disposal plants. I chaired a campaign in Splot in Cardiff, where I was living. I chaired the campaign against the siting of a giant incinerator right next to these residential areas. And I must say, if it had had the technology that I saw at work in China, I might have perhaps not campaigned quite so hard, because I saw a whole number of processes being applied in order to minimize the carbon emissions and to make the maximum use of that waste in terms of producing energy and other sources of power for surrounding communities and businesses. In many cities and outlying villages, I saw solar paneling, for example, a standard feature on all new housing. And the scale of house building, of course, in China has again been something that we haven't seen in Britain, probably in our history, and certainly not seen since the 1950s, and before that during the Industrial Revolution. I saw giant wind farms on our visit to Xinjiang province, a few miles outside the capital city. By far the biggest wind farm I've ever seen in my life, powering the city itself and surrounding villages and so on. And I know that, of course, and this has received some publicity, China has been building 5 very large eco-cities where the end result will be carbon neutral. Again, something far more ambitious than we've ever attempted here in Britain. The only downside was that much of the technology to begin that work had actually been supplied by German companies. I asked whether or not there couldn't have been British companies involved, and they said, unfortunately, British companies in that field and in other fields have been banned from exporting that technology in China because the United States believed that some of it could be turned to military use. That's something, of course, that receives no coverage in the media in Britain. We saw the developments in public transport, railway lines thousands of miles long, stretching across China, new stations, again, of a splendor that I haven't seen the equivalent anywhere in Britain, unless we're talking about Victorian architecture. The city of the super city of Zhejiang was particularly interesting, just on the border with the physical border with Hong Kong. And again, there a new city has been built up around the old. And what was particularly spectacular, and quite rightly our Chinese host boasted of this, nowhere in the city was more than a couple of minutes walk from a park or a garden, and for a public transport mini hub where different forms of public transport would be available. And again, the parks and gardens that were everywhere, that are an essential part of the residential and commercial development that one sees. Very quickly, my visit to Xinjiang, I had told the Radio Cymru researchers that I must be one of the few people they will ever interview who's actually been to Xinjiang, the Uyghur province, and perhaps they might like to ask me a question about that. Well, I thought perhaps quite significantly they didn't. But once more, I haven't been there recently, and therefore I can't comment from personal experience about the claims that are made in the West of supposed genocide against the Uyghurs and so on. But I have learnt this. When our delegation from the Communist Party of Britain, 4 of us, went to Xinjiang and the capital Urumqi and outlying villages, when we were in the capital city, we weren't accompanied everywhere, we weren't chaperoned anywhere. We had a free morning on one occasion, and we decided just to go for a general stroll. We went to the local market, bustling, large market. Everywhere we went, we heard the Uyghur language being spoken. It's recognizable to Western ears, even if we don't speak Uyghur and don't speak Han Chinese. It's a Turkish-based language, sounds completely different to Han Chinese, Mandarin, and so on. We heard it everywhere. We heard it in the marketplace, we heard it in the streets. All of the signs, the public signs and notices, were in the Uyghur language together with Han Chinese, usually Han Chinese second, and occasionally in Russian, because there has been a large Russian community there in the past. When we met the leaders of the party and of the city council, separate meetings, our interpreters from Beijing had to stand down. Special interpreters had to be found locally who could interpret from the Uyghur language into English and back again, because most of the municipal and party leaders that we met spoke Uyghur as their first language and were much more comfortable speaking to us in Uyghur. So after these experiences, we got back to Britain, and within days, and I've put the precise details of the date of a report in The Guardian that we read, of a speech that had been delivered in the European Parliament by the president of the World Uyghur Congress, a congress supposedly of Uyghur people in exile. And this president of the World Uyghur Congress, funded, of course, by the United States National Endowment for Democracy, he told the European parliamentarians how terrible the conditions were in Xinjiang because the Uyghur language was banned. It was a criminal offense to speak it. All of the road signs and public notices are in Han Chinese only, and all of the top officials in the government and the Communist Party in Xinjiang were Han Chinese. Well, the 4 of us had just got back from Xinjiang. We knew for a fact this was completely and utterly untrue. I probably wrote a letter to The Guardian about it. I suspect it was never published. I don't recall it being published. But we had seen the complete opposite of the truth. Now, it's possible our Chinese hosts could have constructed some kind of fairyland city for us and peopled it with Uyghur speakers and put up notice boards everywhere, but I don't think so. The moral of the story is not that I know for certain what's happening in Xinjiang today. The moral of the story is do not take at face value, please do not take at face value what you read in or hear in the Western media about Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, or for that matter, almost anything else that is happening in China. My final point, if I may, perhaps on a more political note, we do hear a lot in the West about so-called Chinese expansionism and so on. And no report, it seems to me, comes from China, from Sky or the BBC and so on, unless there's at least a mention of Tiananmen Square and the so-called massacre, and at least plenty of film of Chinese troops marching up and down. The reality, of course, is something very different. The whole idea of Chinese expansionism into the South China Sea, of course, is rather absurd when you just stop to think of it for a moment. Even more absurd is the idea that British and US and NATO military forces are in the South China Sea and are in the Asia Pacific in order to counter Chinese expansionism. That appears to be the reason why our military bases and our military forces are all across the world, whereas China has not a single military base outside its own borders. We have them across the world, and we are parading in our warships across the South China Sea, supposedly to stop Chinese military expansionism. It rather reminds me of something I read not so long ago about Chinese and Russian expansionism. Why is it they insist on putting their national borders right next to all our military bases? The whole idea is nonsensical, but of course it's to whip up an anti-China psychosis, an anti-China frenzy. And we have to try and combat that. And I'll perhaps leave you with this fact. I researched this morning. I'm not the first person to do it, but I looked up the latest estimates from the Stockholm International Institute for Peace Research. And it confirms that in 2020, the year of the pandemic, when there was so much that we needed to do with our human and financial resources, the first year of the pandemic, I should say, the United States spent more on its military program than the next 12 countries combined, and that includes China. It spent twice as much of its massive GDP, more than twice as much of its GDP, on military expenditure than China did. So again, these reports of whether it's genocide in Xinjiang, whether it's the poor downtrodden people of China, I must admit I didn't see many people who fitted that category on any of my 5, 6 or 7 visits, or whether it's so-called Chinese expansionism. I would just urge everybody, read the Western propaganda by all means. We have no option but to see it on our television and hear it on the radio, but also read other sources. Read sources from inside China, read other sources from outside China. Read sources and hear reports from people in the West who've actually been there and traveled and met Chinese people, discussed with them, and seen at least some of the evidence for their own eyes. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Rob. A really, really powerful contribution there. And I'll add in that list of things that people should read to counter the propaganda against China, that they should, of course, read the Morning Star every day if possible. We're going to move straight on to our next speaker, who Rob's talked about the importance of going to China and finding out for yourself what things are like. Ian Goodrum is speaking to us from Beijing. He is a senior editor and columnist at China Daily. Ian's going to give us his thoughts on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, the new Cold War, and the outlook for Chinese relations with the world. Over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much. Forgive me, I have a little bit of a scratchy throat, so I may be wavering in my speech from time to time, but it's not nervousness, I assure you. At least that's my excuse. So to begin, I wanted to jump off of Rob's point with a bit of an illustrative story, something that I've noticed in my time here. Once a year, the Chinese government has what's called the Lianghui, the 2 sessions of the National People's Congress, its national top legislature, and the Chinese People's Political Association, which is the consultative guiding body which has membership from the non-communist parties and various sectors of society. So it's a big meeting, happens every year at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. Previous to the pandemic, I went every year to cover it as part of my job. And both times that I've been there twice. The last two have been pandemic times, and so attendance has been limited for obvious reasons. But on both occasions, I saw the same thing happen, which was, this is also a time whenever Western media comes, the big media from the United States, the UK, Western Europe, elsewhere, they come kind of with a smug, smarmy attitude about the proceedings, treating it as if it's a big charade, it's a big rubber stamp, non-ceremony, non-efficacious process. But the photographers, it's interesting. It's an interesting point to be made about perception. Every time I was there, both times I was there, I saw with my own eyes a photographer, undoubtedly from one of these outlets, either when taking a picture, framing the picture so that there was a uniformed police officer in the frame with the Great Hall, or, and this was the funniest one, someone holding the camera, getting their shot framed of the hall and waiting until there was a procession of police officers coming by to then snap the photo, just to maximize the effect. So it shows you that you see what you want to see. But I'd like to go from there and say that we're here to talk about the 100 years of the Communist Party of China. And I want to be very clear in my emphasis of the 100 years. We're not separating the history of the party or the country by eras. We're not taking one part of history and saying this part was good and this part was bad. In either direction, we're not saying that the last 42 years were better than the previous 72 years in the PRC. We're not picking a period of history and saying this was the good times and then there was some original sin that ruined everything, the way some people on the left tend to do. We're talking about the 100 years because it is a constant history. It is an unbroken line, and any attempt to divide that line and create an artificial separation between eras to uphold one at the expense of another misses the bigger picture. So what we want to talk about, especially and in reference to this centenary, is the fact that it's the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party and the 72 years since that party has been in power and founded the People's Republic of China, Socialist China. It's in the name of the organization that put this event together. So it's also important to think about the beginnings of the party itself. As was mentioned, some 13 Chinese delegates and 2 international representatives were attending the first National Congress of the Communist Party, representing just over 50 members total. That party, it was just released, is now numbering at over 95 million, about 95 million members. So for those of us in the West, in communist parties in the West, who may be looking at our membership rolls and thinking perhaps that we have a long way to go, we do, but everybody starts somewhere. So something to consider. Something else to consider with the 95 million members that make up the party, that the majority in terms of the vocations, in terms of the societal stratum that the membership comes from, the majority come from what we would traditionally think of as the working class base: farmers, fishermen, herdsmen, service workers, workers in factories, technicians, people that are not considered the elites, people that don't run things in the West. These make up a sizable majority of the members of the CPC. Retirees, students, other groups. So why do these people join the party? Why do they do it? There's an attempt by many when reporting about the Communist Party to say that it's all self-interested, that people join the Communist Party because they want a promotion or a better job, or they want better career prospects or social prospects or what have you. And then for some that may be true. We can't probe the minds and the hearts of every individual party member, but what we can see is that the vast majority of membership comes from a position that grants them very little in terms of their social and career privileges, because they're in what are traditionally thought of as, I guess, well, in the pejorative, you would think of it as, people in the West may think of it as lesser work, as work that's not so prestigious, shall we say. So why join? What's the purpose? There can't be self-interest because again, there's only so far you can go in these fields. So what motivates someone to do it? There's a few answers that I think we can give and that we can think about. First of all, thinking about what China looked like before 1949, what China looked like in 1921, and what it looks like now. Now that's been articulated in great detail already, but I want you to think about a person, and there are many people that are old enough to remember, who are older than 72, who remember what China was like before the CPC took power. You think about this semi-feudal, semi-agrarian society where the GDP per capita was in the hundreds of dollars, if even that. I think less, in fact. You think about the life expectancy being 35 roughly for men and a little bit higher for women, but still very, very young. You think about a country that had over 80% illiteracy. You think about a country that had an infant mortality rate in the very high figures. And from 49 to now, but also from 49 to 78. So again, we're not separating this by eras. This progress has been constant. This progress has been unyielding. There has not been a time where there was not positive developments happening in the country. The life expectancy doubled to now 77, outstripping the US among some demographics now. Illiteracy is now below 3% among the population of the country. Infant mortality is now practically non-existent compared to what it used to be. These basic quality of life factors. So you think about that, you think about the progress people have witnessed, and you realize this is why people still join. This is why people still feel the need to be a part of this great national project. It's not that there is some ulterior motive. And in fact, you don't really get in with an ulterior motive, or you have to deceive quite a few people because the process of joining the party is very strenuous. It requires approval from multiple members. It requires a probationary period of about a year. You have to dedicate yourself. You become part of something greater when you take your oath. I've seen many times. I went to the Red Boat site in Jiaxing in Zhejiang province where the First National Congress was concluded. And when I was there, I saw 3 different groups of people raising their fist and taking the party oath. And I saw that when I was in Yan'an, the revolutionary base area where the Red Army fought and consolidated its forces and eventually won. There are many historical sites there now, and there are sites where people go and retake their oaths or take their oaths for the first time. And part of that oath is to serve the people wholeheartedly and to put the interests of the people above your own. And this is enforced through various means that we could go into if we had more time on this topic. But the point is, you may, even if you have the idea that you might get some benefit, you cannot rest on your laurels as a party member. You are required to maintain a log, a study log. You are required to take part in study sessions. You have to take part in volunteer activities, whether you want to or not. This is your role as a party member. So even if people go into it with certain motives in mind, by the structure of the party, by the nature of the party, by the fact that serve the people, Wei Ren Min Fu Wu is still the motto, you have to do these things. So it's not up to you. You volunteer to join this organization and you take on the mantle of someone who's willing to serve the people wholeheartedly. So as we heard so much about in General Secretary Xi's speech on Thursday. So really, as far as the present day, I think it's also important to consider, in addition to the history, in addition to the progress, this notion not just of self-confidence, which is important, of course, because China, as we know, is a country that was subjugated for over a century by foreign powers, and now it is standing up on its own 2 feet. Mao Zedong himself said the Chinese people have stood up in October 1949. But there's more to it than that, because there have been many national liberation stories that have been greater, that have been a success, that have shown great promise, but they don't have the same level of accomplishment, I think, that China does, because it was a revolution for national liberation, but it was also a revolution, a socialist revolution for the betterment of the people, to make people the masters of the country, to elevate everyone. So you may have success stories for national liberation that were sidetracked by the underlying contradictions of the capitalist systems that were maintained in those countries. China has not frowned upon letting in foreign investment or foreign expertise, but the key difference, and this is key to its development over the last 42 years especially, is that although it is letting in foreign investment, it is not letting in foreign exploitation. You can come in and do business in China. You can make money. You know, there is an element of benefit, but it takes place on the terms that were set by the party and the people, to the point where you can't just wander in and take over an entire industry and turn it private. You can't bring in your multinational behemoth companies and dictate to the government what you want or don't want, the way it happens so often in other places. You have to play by the rules. And if you don't play by the rules, you don't get to do business. That's just how it is. And that's one of the many things that makes China's revolution and development so distinct from other countries, which is why, one of the many reasons why, and there's not enough time to get into all of them because we'd be here for hours, that I believe China's condition, development, situation, and path is unique and still worthy of being called socialist. So I'm going to wrap it up there because I'm running low on my time, but I appreciate it very much. Thanks for letting me speak.
Thank you so much, Ian. That was a really interesting contribution on the nature of being a party member in China and Chinese socialism. Thanks so much for that. This meeting is being hosted in Britain, of course, and in Xi Jinping's speech on Thursday, he noted the beginning of the century of humiliation, the Opium Wars, by which Britain seized Hong Kong from China. Britain ruled Hong Kong for 150 years. There is still a strong element of colonial mentality in the way that the British establishment views Hong Kong. A lot of the coverage, you would think that Hong Kong was still British, from the way that our ministers try to lecture the Chinese on what should be happening there. So I'm really, really pleased, because of the weight of disinformation that we get about Hong Kong in this country, to have two speakers from Hong Kong on our panel today. The first of those is Nixie Lam from the Democratic Alliance for the Betterment of Hong Kong. Nixie is going to be talking to us a little bit about what's really happening in Hong Kong, the political situation there, and the contrast, I suppose, with what we hear about it over here. Thanks, Nixie.
Thank you, Ben. I think one of the thing that I really want to talk about, as a lot of everybody knows, like in Hong Kong is like a really like a West meets East kind of city, where we are normally sort of leaning down to the Western side, more leaning on that. But it's just like a norm, sort of like a normal practice that we have been doing all this time. But as you know, in 2019, what we actually face is something is really devastating for the city. We never like as a Hong Konger in Hong Kong, I couldn't imagine that would actually happen in Hong Kong. You know, Hong Kong used to be a place where if you are down in the MTR train station, if you bump into someone, somebody would just gonna say, "Oh, I'm sorry," that kind of thing. But in 2019, people are okay with people throwing petrol bombs to police officers, throwing petrol bombs to normal citizens only because their views are different to them. I think that really strikes through a lot of us, like what really happened all those years. In 2014, we have Occupy Central. A lot of people say, well, it is okay because they're peaceful, they're only occupying the streets, they're not doing anything that is too violent and this and that. But I think if you look back from now, 2021, we can basically see that is like a little introduction, like a little appetizer of what is actually planned in 2019. A lot of people saying that, well, Occupy Central and the Hong Kong riots in 2019 is something that's only motivated by the people. But seriously, for me, myself, during the Occupy Central time, 2014, I actually went down. Well, of course, I cover up my face because I don't want to be recognized at those situations. But I covered my face. I went down to the scene. I see protesters everywhere. They were sitting around, not doing too much like violent things. They're just sitting around. But one thing that I observed is the sort of like foods and snacks that is actually provided to them were so properly prepared. Like the brand name of those snacks was those like really expensive exported ones from overseas. The type of water and the amount of like non-stop supply of those. Contrasting to me as a district councillor at that time, I remember when there's an outbreak of the Occupy Central, I got a little phone call of the police officer who was working as a PR in my constituency. He called me up and he says like, Nixie, do you know the biscuit factories in your constituency? It's a Saturday, so they're not opening. That we ran out of food. Like as the police officers, we don't have any food. Is it okay for us to contact them and buy some little biscuits from them? So that contrast, you can basically observe how different and whether it is really motivated by the people or somebody else. Still in 2019, a lot of people doesn't really understand, and they're saying that well, there isn't any foreign power. Come on, it's just the people. But we can see the wave of introducing the whole thing and how the Western media was trying to make the scene as in well, they're all peaceful protesters. I remember when they first attacked, before they attacked the Legislative Council complex, which is in June 2019. I was interviewed with the BBC, and then they were asking me, well, they are all peaceful protesters, isn't it? I was like, no, there are a bunch of really extremists within the scene. Well, we do have, like, say, 90% of them are actually peaceful protesters, but then you got like 10% of the very extremists. They're attacking the building and stuff. So we need to tackle that. For any country that needs to keep the stability of the city, they have to do something. But then they're like, no, we're only focusing, you shouldn't focus on those people. We're only focusing on the peaceful protesters. Like, that is not right. And then I was like, later on, when things goes down, they first of all, they sort of like wrap around the head of police station in Hong Kong, the head of police quarters. And then the second attempt is to basically destroy the whole Legislative Council complex building. And they actually went inside and destroyed everything. I talked to a lot of the legislators. They're saying the computer and the room were searched. Some of the documentation were gone. Some of the the internet connections and everything were totally destroyed. So it's not something normal. But what we only see from a lot of the Western media, they're only focusing, well, oh, they leave some money for the drinks in the fridge, so they are peaceful people. I mean, come on, look at how much the building were destroyed. How many facade of the glasses, like outside glasses, were destroyed. Like you see they're all masked up. They're with the helmet, they're with the bat, and they're just hitting the building. But nobody actually cared about anything. So the whole thing is just like really bad situation. That's why in 2020, I was actually invited representing Hong Kong to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Council to basically speak out the truth. I went there 3 times in March in person, went down to Geneva, and also the June and September meetings to basically tell people what exactly happened. A lot of people, when they talk about Hong Kong situation at that time, they often talk about, oh, that police brutality and they're killing people. I mean, that's a lie. That's a big fat lie. Nobody got killed by any police officers. And what happened is the police officers were the ones that were heavily targeted, including the family members. So even though like they're elderly members of the family, or even though their kids were in kindergarten schools, the teachers, where they're having different political views, were targeting those kids. They were their students. They're targeting them, and they're abusing and bullying the kids where they're already, 4 years old, and telling them, well, you're evil because your father is a police officer. That kind of thing. And it's not only one situation, it's like multiple in every sort of levels. People, we have a special word of what we call human search. A lot of people doesn't understand. It's when they identify you, because Hong Kong is a very packed community in Hong Kong. It's basically very easy to identify a person if you put the person's face online. Basically, you have like second or third tier of a person, you know. And they will search your information. They will expose the full ID number, your addresses, who's your relatives. They will post information online. Even my information were actually on one Telegram over the years up until this year. I have another report to the police this year, 17 times. All my information, including my information of my husband, my parents' addresses, everything. And they were asking people to attack me. They were saying that after the elections in 2019, we're gonna punch up Nixie. And that is not something like it's only happening to me. we have like politicians were under attack. My office is okay because my office is actually under a very famous like a businessman's mall, so my office is okay. But we have multiple politicians' office were under attack. They were petrol bombed. I have a friend, his office has been attacked for 11 times by petrol bomb. Can you imagine one single little office being burned down 11 times? What else would be left at that time? But, I mean, a lot of people doesn't understand. They keep on saying that's police brutality, and they'll say like the people of Hong Kong's freedom were being suppressed. I tell you, the people's expression of freedom is being suppressed. It's like the normal, ordinary Hong Kong people. We don't dare to go out, basically, because every day we're receiving messages from WhatsApp to say, okay, stay. The protest is going to be in Causeway Bay, so nobody should go to Causeway Bay. Because it's basically, if you're there, you cannot get out. Even though you're elderly or whatever, they don't care. You just block the road, whack all the shops. If they think it's like, even the banks is like the Chinese bank or whatever, and they'll just burn down the banks and burn down the shops and just do it whatever. I remember during the National Day celebration, there was this guy that he was just only saying that, well, I'm Chinese, and trying to sing the national anthem because he's not happy while the guys were occupying the streets. He got punched up and his blood shedded all over his face, and the guys were pulling down his pants. It's like whole humiliation. But did any Western media emphasize on those incidents? No. They would keep on saying that, oh, those are peaceful protesters. They are doing the good for Hong Kong. They're human rights fighters. They're freedom fighters. They're not. So, I mean, that sort of thing really makes us normal Hong Kong people really angry. You know what's really angry about it? We have enacted our national security law last year, and now we have our electoral reform done. But I mean, it's like I came back from Beijing for the celebration, centenary celebration. I landed on the 1st of July at night at about 11. What happened is when I turned on my phone, these protesters went down behind one police officer and stabbed him. And you know what? I spoke to some other reporters. The Guardians and the BBC didn't even mention this incident. Do people really know that that sort of things happens in Hong Kong? They're just plain rioters doing this sort of like really terrorist behavior. So I think a lot of people really need to understand what really happens in Hong Kong. And I mean the CPC really trying to help Hong Kong. That's why we have enacted our national security law and the electoral reform. And basically, we're trying to make sure not only Hong Kong will stabilize on the surface, but will stabilize as a whole in a long run. Right. I think my time is a bit running out. I spoke too much, but yeah, I'll pass it on to someone else.
Thank you so much, Nixie. I think it's really important that people in Britain and around the world hear what you have to say, because as you say, it's a completely different picture from what we see on the BBC, from what we read in British newspapers about what the situation is really like in Hong Kong. And that's why I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker as well. This is Lam Chun Sing, the chair of the Federation of Hong Kong and Kowloon Labour Unions. There's several different union federations in Hong Kong. I know they take different attitudes to political developments, but we do need to get the voice of Hong Kong trade unionists heard in the labour movement in Britain. So I'm really, really pleased to introduce Lam. Thanks, Lam.
Thanks to Ben and Nixie and other guests that I have the opportunities to share something on this topic. This year marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. And I think over the past century, the party has united and led the people in the battle against the poverty. And China is one of the largest countries in the world with a population of 1.4 billion. And due to the historical background and uneven development and also other problems, that I think it was a very, very difficult task to alleviate the poverty in China. But in 1978, there was a new chapter, there's reform and opening up policy. And that's we call socialist modernization in China. And the rapid socio-economic development speed up the poverty alleviation, and also resulted in a sharp decline in the number of poor population. And in 2011, the central government also set a clear target on the battle against the poverty to ensure that the moderate prosperities would be achieved by 2020. And at the end of the 2020, China achieved another goal is to eliminate all the extreme poverty. So according to some international statistics, for example, the World Bank's international poverty line, the number of Chinese people live out of the poverty over the past 40 years since the opening up policy accounts for more than 70% of the world's total. So as you can see, China made a great contribution on the global poverty reduction. And these contributions were also recognized by the United Nations. And when we look back in Hong Kong, although Hong Kong is an international financial center, but our wealth disparity problem is very serious. And the Hong Kong government only believed in the policy of laissez-faire. They do not interfere the market so much, and just like the small government and big market. And their concept is only to develop the economy so that the workers can share something. But the Hong Kong Gini coefficient is very high, which means that this concept is wrong. And also, apart from developing the economy, we also need more labor policy or resources allocation policy. So our grassroots worker can share the fruits of economic development. And also, last year, the director of liaison office of the central government in Hong Kong, he visited the poor family and the residents in the subdivided flats and the elderly in the community. And I think this was a political symbol, and the significance is very strong that Hong Kong have many deep-seated problems on people's livelihood. For example, the housing problem. And I think the central government understands these issues, and so that I think the Hong Kong government should do something on that. And another issue is that I want to share something on the one country, two system and the situation of the union in Hong Kong. Now the official slogan is to celebrating the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party in China, and also the 24th anniversary of Hong Kong's return to motherland. This we call one country, two system. And I remember that Mr. Deng Xiaoping said that we adopt the one country, two system approach to solve the Hong Kong problem. And it is completely based on the reality and fully takes into account the history, the actual situation, and the reality of the Hong Kong. And now we face a new situation in Hong Kong because we have national security law. And I think the purpose of the legislation is to prevent the action of, for example, the secession, subversion of state power, and advocating Hong Kong independence, or some people connect with foreign external force to endanger the national security. I think it only targets on extremely small minority. I think the basic rights and freedom enjoyed by the citizen will be protected. And there's nothing for Hong Kong citizens to worry about in exercising their rights under the basic law. For example, from the angle of the trade union in Hong Kong, I think Hong Kong people can organize trade union and also can continue to participate in the union activity. And also, some of our trade union in Hong Kong is also the affiliate members of some international trade union organization. They can discuss many labor issues like in the past. And also the International Labor Convention, which recognized by the Hong Kong government, will still be effective. So I think the union rights in Hong Kong are protected by the basic law. So that's what I want to share with other guests. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you very much. Another really informative contribution, and it's so important to have voices from Hong Kong and China with us today. Just before we move to our next speaker, we're going to be showing a short video. The Morning Star has been working closely together this year with China Media Group Europe on marking the centenary, and we hope to build cooperative relations with China Media Group and CCTV Europe in our coverage of China to improve our coverage of the country. And there was a very interesting article by Comrade Zhang He in the Morning Star earlier this week about the European links of the founders of the Chinese Communist Party, with many of the original communists traveling to work in Europe and discovering Marxism while they were doing so. So I believe Carlos is going to be switching on this quick 4-minute video about the European links of the Chinese Communist Party.
In 1919, the May 4th movement unveiled a new chapter in China in the struggle against imperialism and feudalism. Between 1919 and 1921, thousands of young Chinese traveled to Europe as members of the work-study movement, in the hope of finding a path to save the future of China.
My hope is that China will no longer be controlled by foreign countries. Our people will no longer be bullied by officials. Everyone can live a good life, and we form a family of mutual help and love. I'm willing to fight for this.
Amongst them were the future leaders of the Communist Party of China. 16-year-old Deng Xiaoping arrived in Marseille in October 1920, as reported by a local French newspaper. That same year, 22-year-old Zhu Enlai boarded a passenger ship in Shanghai. This started an awakening journey in Europe. Despite his late arrival, Zhu Enlai examined the workers' movement in Britain in early 1921. In Paris, Zhu studied French while conducting social research. He also studied various Marxist books, such as the Communist Manifesto, and wrote for the Chinese newspaper Ishibao on the unstoppable trend of revolution. After comparing with other social doctrines, Zhu Enlai made a lifelong commitment to the communist cause and joined the Paris Communist Group in 1921. Meanwhile, Deng Xiaoping went to work in factories after attending middle school in Bayeux in France. He worked at an iron and steel plant and then a rubber factory, where he recognized the deep-rooted problems of the struggling working class. It's also where he met other like-minded young people, perhaps to save China through industrial salvation. For Deng Xiaoping, this became a broken dream. He started to read the progressive magazine New Youth. Each day, his desire to join a revolutionary party was growing. The French town of Montargis was a turning point for Deng Xiaoping. It was the place where he became interested in Marxism. It was also here where the idea of establishing a communist party in China was formally advocated. Meanwhile, Zhou Enlai worked as a journalist, traveling between Paris and Berlin. He witnessed the demonstrations of Chinese students in Lyon and advocated the idea of communism in Germany. In June 1922, like-minded young people were finally united by the European branch of the Chinese Communist Youth Party and had their own magazine, La Jeunesse. 17 Rue Godefroy, Paris, is a place where Zhou Enlai once lived. It's also where he worked with Deng Xiaoping, who joined the magazine later. In 1924, their footpath was diverted. Zhou Enlai went back to China as communist revolutions spread across the country, while Deng Xiaoping carried on the communist cause in France and left for Moscow in 1926. By that time, both had grown from progressive youths into professional revolutionaries. Today, this building in Paris is lucky enough to have a plaque to its famous former resident, Zhou Enlai. While the town of Montargis is proud of its association with Deng Xiaoping, even naming the square outside the railway station after him. A sculpture is also dedicated to the work-study movement. A century on, it's time to retrace their red footsteps, which reveal the journey that shaped the future path of China.
Well, many thanks to the China Media Group Europe and to Zhang He for that amazing video. What an inspirational story of cooperation across borders, something we need more of today. We're going to be moving to our next speaker, Jenny Clegg. Jenny is an authority on China, an author, researcher, and China specialist, a regular contributor to the Morning Star over many years, and a prominent campaigner in the British peace movement. Jenny's going to be taking us through 100 years of Chinese communism. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks very much, Ben. And what a fascinating history you've uncovered there. That's great. Of course, the story of how the Chinese Communist Party was founded in secret by just a handful of people and has now grown into an organization of some 95 million members is truly remarkable. The story of China's transformation from the sick man of Asia into the world's second largest economy goes together with that of the CPC, because the party provided the political architecture that made this development possible. Taking stock at 100 years means looking not only at China's achievements, but also at what this has meant and means for the world. The CPC story is one full of twists and turns, of tenacity against adversity, retreating when retreat was necessary, but also daring to seize the time when the opportunity arose. What has given the CPC its strength, its courage to face reality, to learn from mistakes, was and is Marxism. For the Chinese Communist Party, Marxism is not a dogma, but a set of tools applied concretely to solve China's problems. The key to the success of the revolution in 1949 lay mainly in the party's ability to mobilize the people effectively around both national and social and class goals. For this, it drew on Marxist class analysis to devise a revolutionary strategy of shared benefit so as to unite all who could be united in the common goals of ending foreign domination and building the nation. Fundamental here was land reform, which gained the CPC the support of hundreds of millions of peasants. They participated in its mass organizations, they joined the party itself, they carried out and conformed with its policies, and they gave material support in paying taxes and enlisting in its armies. China's contribution to the defeat of worldwide fascism in 1949 is often overlooked in the West. It was communist resistance together with the nationalist armies that kept Japanese troops bogged down in China so that the Soviets could concentrate all their forces against the Nazis on the Western Front. This cost up to 20 million Chinese lives. Nor is it widely understood that China was the first country to end colonial rule, as the Allies agreed in 1943 to give up the unequal treaties. China was to be one of the founding members of the United Nations, and the CPC was present at that occasion. The example of how the Chinese people, led by the Communist Party, gained liberation in 1949 shone a bright light for colonized people around the world. Its experience of People's War, revolution, and the transformation of rural society was to be the inspiration for many national liberation movements in many different countries in the years to come. After 1949, the stabilization of the country within a couple of years was truly remarkable, given the century of turmoil and war that had gone before. China could now begin to focus on its development. It was far less developed than the Soviet Union had been at the start, but the party had the support of the peasants, the overwhelming majority of the population. This made possible an agricultural strategy of cooperation before mechanization. And in 1956, striking while the iron was hot, Mao led China into the socialist era. Through collective effort, the country greatly expanded its irrigation systems, undertook major infrastructural projects, for example, the building of the bridge over the Yangtze, which brought the north and the south of the country together in Nanjing. It developed the foundations of heavy industry, and rural industrialization was vital in maintaining the support of the peasants, while the organization of health and welfare in the commune system was designed to make sure no one was left behind. Certainly there were terrible and tragic losses in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, but economic growth in the Mao era on average at some 5% a year was above that of other developing countries. The biggest mistake that Mao made, in my view, was the failure to take population control seriously from the 1950s. Life expectancy went up, the birth rate shot up, placing a huge strain on the economy. External circumstances were extremely hostile. The Korean and the Vietnam Wars fought on China's borders, the eventual split from the Soviet Union leaving China vulnerable. The Cold War all but eradicated China from Western consciousness, and in my school years, China was never mentioned, it just didn't exist. Yet a great deal was achieved for the world at that time, as Zhou Enlai and Nehru agreed the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, and China, with other Asian and African countries at the Bandung Conference, laid the basis for South-South cooperation, and indeed an entirely new type of international relations based on the equality of nations. By 1979, China's situation had changed dramatically. It now had a certain level of overall industrialization and the basics to feed and clothe the population. Meanwhile, rapprochement with the United States presented new opportunities, and this time it was Deng Xiaoping that dared to turn China around. Reform and opening up has seen hundreds of millions of people leave the countryside to work in the cities. Rural population has fallen from 80% to less than 40% of the total now. And such a massive restructuring has meant the party adopting a top-down approach to build the cities, build the housing, provide the services, the schools, the hospitals, and so on, whilst freeing the private sector and inviting foreign investment to help create employment. The ranks of the Chinese working class has swelled enormously. And just as the private sector has grown, the state-owned sector has grown also, the government careful to ensure that the balance is in favour of the latter. Following years of double-digit growth, more recently, the emphasis has shifted to considerations of the environment, health, consumption, innovation, and so on. And the countryside has not been neglected, as Rob was describing earlier, with the provision of services, water, electricity, internet connections, as well as a system of cooperative health insurance. China became the workshop of the world, and just how important it was to the global economy became evident in 2008, when it was China's massive injection of funds for infrastructure that effectively prevented the world financial crisis from becoming a prolonged global depression. China is now a more important trading partner than the US for 2/3 of the world. And as it entered onto the world stage, China made suggestions to reform the existing international institutions, such as the IMF, the World Trade Organization, and the UN. These proposals being resisted, China has gone ahead to form alternative institutions, the AIIB, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the BRICS Bank, and so on, driving forward the multipolar trend. There is still a long way to go to continue to improve the conditions of hundreds of millions of rural migrants who still have a hard life, to escape the middle income trap where exports are no longer competitive either at the low or the high end, to upgrade the technological base, reaching new frontiers, and all of this now under an all-out onslaught from the US new Cold War. Yet the party has set ambitious targets for the next 15 years to double the average per capita income, to become a global leader in innovation, and to turn carbon emissions towards decline. Within 10 years, the Chinese economy will overtake the US. In another 10 years, it may be more than double. What this will mean for the world is hard to imagine. It is sobering to think that from the founding commitment of the Chinese Communist Party to ease the burdens of the Chinese people, it has taken 100 years to eliminate extreme poverty. Really, that is how hard the going is. But if it becomes easier for other countries to follow as multipolarity gains in strength and momentum, not least through the Belt and Road Initiative, this will surely be China's greatest achievement. By 2049, China aims to become a modern socialist country and a global leader. Looking ahead to these goals, Xi Jinping has called to mind China's revolutionary history and its long march. And he has also introduced a word of caution, noting recently that an important reason for the collapse of the Soviet Union was that the Communist Party became detached from the people and turned into a privileged bureaucratic group that only defended its own interests. Over its 100-year history, the Chinese Communist Party has demonstrated extraordinary flexibility and creativity. During the revolutionary period in particular, the party honed its democratic practices of democratic centralism and the mass line, learning from past mistakes, criticism and self-criticism, opening the door of the party to evaluate performance, working from top down and bottom up, handling antagonistic contradictions by non-antagonistic methods. It is by keeping to these practices that the party will continue to lead the Chinese people to prosperity and the world finally, eventually, to peace. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jenny, for a really brilliant potted history of the Chinese Revolution there and the prospects for another 100 years, which may be even more inspirational than the last 100 years. So thanks for that. You touched on the new Cold War, obviously a huge topic for all of us at the moment, potentially the most important topic in international relations, the growing antagonism of the United States towards China and the conflict between the world's two biggest economies. In March, we saw in that Alaska summit a fiery clash between the Chinese and US not foreign ministers. Yang Jiechi, I believe, is the head of the Foreign Affairs Department of the Chinese Communist Party. And he contrasted the dramatic difference in approach between China and the United States to international relations, saying that China does not use war to impose its will on others. We do not believe in invading or toppling other governments or massacring the people of other countries, as Yang said in Alaska. So I'm really pleased that our last speaker is going to focus a little bit on China's role in the world and what China's centenary means internationally. It's Keith Bennett, co-editor of Friends of Socialist China. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you very much, Ben. I think what I have to say overlaps a bit with what you said I would say, but first of all, we're really pleased to join with our friends and comrades in the Morning Star at this meeting. And, you know, the role of the Morning Star is becoming ever more vital in opposing the new Cold War and in defending and supporting China. Now, the Communist Party of China is, I believe, the world's most important political party. We've heard the membership figures. I'd just say that that membership is greater than all the other communist and workers' parties in the world and all other political parties professing a commitment to socialism combined. The Communist Party of China, as we've heard, is a Marxist political party. It leads the world's most populous country and the world's second largest economy. China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and today, be it international financial crisis, global pandemic, the looming threat of climate change, or regional hotspots, no major issue facing humanity can be successfully tackled without China's active and constructive input. The centenary of the CPC is therefore, or at least ought to be, an occasion for celebration, not only for the Chinese people, but also for all socialists, anti-imperialists, and progressive people throughout the world. The CPC has, from its inception, been an internationalist party. It represented the striving of Chinese patriots to find a viable way to save the people and rejuvenate the nation. But it also arose directly from the October Socialist Revolution in neighboring Russia. As Chairman Mao memorably put it, the salvos of the October Revolution brought us Marxism-Leninism. Before the October Revolution, the Chinese people did not even know the names of Marx and Engels, let alone that of Lenin. Now, there is, of course, room for discussion on the later part played by the Comintern in certain phases of the Chinese Revolution, but the founding of the CPC is surely inseparable from its support and assistance. And the CPC's early and rapid growth and development, in particular during the period of the First United Front between the CPC and the Kuomintang from 1924 to 1927, also owed an enormous amount to the Comintern's all-round assistance and advice. In turn, the Chinese Revolution was also intimately connected with the revolution in neighboring countries in particular. Jenny's just mentioned how it was the Chinese people's resistance above all that ensured that throughout the period of the anti-fascist World War, the Soviet Union never had to fight on two fronts at the same time. And the leaders of the Vietnamese and Korean revolutions, Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il-sung, both spent an important part of their revolutionary careers in China. And in keeping with the general practice of the international communist movement at that time, both became CPC members during that period of their life. The founding of the People's Republic of China on October the 1st, 1949, of course, played a major role in shifting the balance of forces in the world in favor of socialism, people's democracy, national independence, and peace. But just 1 year later, China was at war again. US imperialism's vicious war in Korea posed a direct threat to China, and not only of a land invasion. The increasingly unhinged US General MacArthur actually proposed the dropping of atomic weapons on all the major cities of both China and the Soviet Union. It was no easy thing for the fledgling People's Republic, faced with overwhelming problems of poverty and backwardness, and devastated by decades of turmoil, invasion, and war, to decide to confront US imperialism head on. The mobilization of the vast Chinese People's Volunteer Army as a result of Chairman Mao's bold strategic decision and commanded by Marshal Peng Dehuai in the war to resist aggression and aid Korea, to safeguard peace and defend our homes, not only turned the tide on the Korean Peninsula, it arguably prevented a land invasion of China and certainly made a massive contribution to ensuring that a pro-US regime was not installed on China's northeastern border, about 1,000 kilometers from Beijing and facing into its then industrial heartland. But the cost and scale of sacrifice was enormous, above all in hundreds of thousands of casualties, including Chairman Mao's own son, Mao Anying, who lies buried in Korean soil. Besides, the US sent its 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Straits, preventing the complete liberation and reunification of China, and imposed a crippling economic embargo that was to last until 1972. In my view, part of the special character of the Chinese Revolution lies in that it is both a socialist revolution led by a Marxist-Leninist party and simultaneously an anti-imperialist revolution in a semi-colonial country of a people of color who constitute the overwhelming global majority. I think this still carries tremendous significance in a world that to a considerable extent remains characterized by Lenin's definition of one divided into a small number of oppressor nations on the one hand and a great mass of oppressed nations on the other. Hence, the concept of a united front against imperialism in one form or another has always been intrinsic to the foreign policy of the People's Republic. Jenny's mentioned the Bandung Conference of Afro-Asian countries in 1955, where Zhou Enlai played a leading role. And she's also mentioned his initiation with the leaders of India and Burma of the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, which with their stress on mutual respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, non-aggression and non-interference in internal affairs, and equality and mutual benefit represent the antithesis of the imperialist approach to international relations. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s in particular, China actively and militantly supported anti-imperialist struggles in the world. Most significant was the massive support it extended to the peoples of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in their struggles against the brutal US war of aggression. More than 300,000 Chinese troops were committed to Vietnam, where they enabled more Vietnamese fighters to join the front line in the south by defending and rehabilitating the railways and manning the anti-aircraft defenses in major cities like Hanoi and Haiphong in the north. And China also extended considerable support to national liberation movements in countries like Algeria, Palestine, Guinea-Bissau, Oman, Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and numerous other countries. For example, in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela recalls how he sent Walter Sisulu to China as far back as 1954 to secure support for the anti-apartheid struggle. China also began its foreign aid programs when it was still itself a very poor country. China's medical assistance to Africa, which continues to this day, began with the dispatch of 100 healthcare workers to Algeria in 1963, very shortly after that country gained its independence from France. Between 1970 to 1975, China built the Tazara Railway, together with Zambia and Tanzania, to enable Zambia to freely export its copper, breaking its economic dependence on then white ruled Rhodesia and South Africa. The construction and cost in today's value was in excess of 2.7 billion US dollars. And significantly, recipients of Chinese aid included countries which then had much higher standards of living than China itself. For example, in 1975, China built the popularly known Red China Dock in Malta, the largest dry dock in the Mediterranean, after the progressive government of Dom Mintoff expelled the British military base and embraced non-alignment. Now, after Mao's death in 1976, as we've heard, the leadership around Deng Xiaoping placed overwhelming emphasis on domestic economic development. In personal discussions with Chinese comrades over those ensuing years, I was repeatedly told that a stronger and more prosperous China will be able to make a much greater contribution to people throughout the world in the future. And today, I think we can see more clearly what this means. Consistently displaying a strategy of multilateralism and multipolarity, China is steadily laying down the building blocks of a genuinely new international political and economic order through such means as the BRICS grouping, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and similar mechanisms with, for example, the countries of East and Southeast Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, and Central and Eastern Europe, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and above all, the Belt and Road Initiative. Whilst China does not interfere in others' affairs or seek to export revolution, as Fidel Castro and Hugo Chavez both recognized, China is today the most indispensable external factor for countries seeking to defend their independence and build socialism. And as Comrade Xi Jinping put it at the 19th Party Congress in October 2017, the path, the theory, the system, and the culture of socialism with Chinese characteristics have kept developing, blazing a new trail for other developing countries to achieve modernization. It offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence. One does not have to agree with China on everything to appreciate, especially having experienced the loss of the Soviet Union, that the loss of the People's Republic of China would be an unmitigated disaster, not only for the Chinese people, but for any people who today seek to defend their independence and build a new society. And to say that the CPC has always been an internationalist party does not mean that one has to consider that all of China's policies and actions have always been correct. Life is certainly a lot more complicated than that. We could discuss who bears the primary responsibility for the Sino-Soviet split, but what seems beyond dispute to me is that it was, along with the collapse of the USSR and the European socialist bloc, to which it is intimately related, the greatest tragedy and misfortune to befall the international communist and workers' movement, whose negative consequences we are still experiencing. That is why, and especially in the context of the new Cold War, it is so important to support and defend the People's Republic of China today. In November 1989, faced with the events in Eastern Europe, Deng Xiaoping observed to Tanzanian President Julius Nyerere, "So long as socialism does not collapse in China, it will always hold its ground in the world." In today's world, I think we can see even more clearly the correctness and farsightedness of that statement. And it is in this spirit that we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Keith. What a great note to end on. Absolutely, absolutely agree with all of that in terms of the crucial importance of China and the Chinese Communist Party for the cause of socialism internationally and for the cause of peace. That's why it's so important that we continue to hold events like these to spread information, spread knowledge about what's happening in China, and allow people in the West to hear voices from China about the realities there, because it is still a country which is very widely misunderstood, even on the left of politics in the West. So I would like to finish there. We've gone slightly over our time. I'd like to thank, first of all of our amazing speakers from Beijing, Hong Kong, the United States, Cardiff, all over the place. So really thank you to all of you for speaking today, to all of our attendees, everybody watching on Facebook and YouTube. There's been lots of links in the chat, so do start reading the Morning Star, do follow Friends of Socialist China if you enjoyed what you heard today. There is plenty more coverage of China in from both organizations, so there's plenty to learn. I will give a quick plug to Friends of Socialist China's next event, Understanding China's Socialism. It's an event co-hosted by Friends of Socialist China, the Morning Star, Learning from China, and the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. This is a launch event for the book China's Great Road by John Ross, an excellent history of Chinese socialism. It's on next Saturday, 2 p.m. in Britain, 9 p.m. in China, 9 a.m. US Eastern Time, 6 a.m. US Pacific Time. The link, I believe, is going to be posted in the chat, or I can post it now. We would love to see as many of you there as possible, so do tune into that. Thanks again to everyone for attending today. Thanks to the China Media Group Europe for all of your help with the video and for all of your recent cooperation with the Morning Star. And thank you, congratulations to the Chinese Communist Party on 100 years of revolutionary struggle. Solidarity, comrades.